It began, as the Dramese things so often did, with rain-thin, indecisive rain that traced uncertain lines upon the stone faces of St. Bartholomew's quadrangle. The sound of it against the leaded panes was faint but persistent, a kind of whispering, as if the old buildings were confiding in one another across centuries of silence. I remember thinking, rather gloomily, that Oxford wears its sorrows best when wet. I had been summoned, or perhaps merely lured by a note. It lay on my desk that morning, unsigned, the handwriting small and angular, written with what I fancied was a woman's impatience. The message was brief. "There is something beneath the chapel you ought to hear." It was the kind of sentence that lingers in the mind, not because of what it says, but because of what it withholds. Lewis had driven, of course. He spoke as we crossed the High, his words steady as rain on the windscreen, about the college bursar who'd made the call, about the locked crypt, about some local boys claiming they'd heard music chanting, even beneath the floor. I let him talk. Silence, I've often found, is a more revealing instrument than speech. The porter met us at the gate, the sort of man whose expression seemed to apologize for existing. He led us through the courtyard, past the sodden lawns, to the chapel door. The air inside was still close, with that peculiar coldness found only in buildings too accustomed to prayer. The porter hesitated before lifting the trap near the chancel, as though expecting the devil himself to greet us from below. The steps descended into darkness, and for a time there was only the sound of dripping. My torch caught fragments of stone, damp and uneven, the walls lined with centuries of neglect. I've never cared much for ghosts, but there was a weight in that place, something older than fear, something like remembrance. Lewis muttered that it was probably rats. He was right, of course. He usually is when I wish he weren't. Yet even as he spoke, I felt a current of air move past my face, cold, deliberate, directional. Air, I reasoned, demands passage. Somewhere unseen, the crypt breathed. We found nothing that first time. Only an echo, low and oddly human, that came from beyond the far wall. I pressed my hand to the stone. It was wet, but warmer than I expected, as though something lived behind it. Later, back in my room, I poured a whiskey and considered the note again. The handwriting nagged at me. The shape of the T, the way it leaned backward, hesitant yet proud. I had seen it before in a letter from the college archivist some months earlier, a woman with a fondness for Schubert and an unfortunate marriage. She'd written to thank me for finding her lost bicycle. She had, I recalled, an unsteady voice, like a violin playing in another room. It wasn't the discovery of the crypt that disturbed me. It was the sense that someone had wanted me there not to solve something, but to feel something. To remember, perhaps what I had spent years trying to forget. Oxford is full of ghosts, but most of them walk upright, bearing keys and regrets. As I sat by the window, the rain had eased to mist. I watched the college lamps flicker in the courtyard below, the stones breathing steam like sleepers caught in a dream too deep to end. Somewhere in the distance, a bell sounded for half an hour. I thought again of the note's phrasing. There is something beneath the chapel you ought to hear. Not see, not found, hear. The distinction mattered. Words are always chosen for a reason. And beneath the noise of rain and silence, I fancied I could still hear that faint, rhythmical whisper against stone, a sound that was neither voice nor memory, but something between. That was how it began. Not with a body, not with a clue, but with the sound of Oxford breathing through the cracks of its own forgotten conscience. It was the morning after the rain when the body was found. A porter, the same man who had guided us to the chapel, came stumbling into the lodge, his face the colour of parchment left too close to a candle flame. I remember the way he tried to speak, the words catching as though his throat could not bear to form them. Lewis and I were in the quad by then, watching the mist uncurl from the grass. There are moments, I think, when Oxford looks ashamed of its own beauty. The body lay in the Fellows' garden, an enclosed square of green hemmed in by yews and sentiment. She was a woman in her 40s, well dressed, but without extravagance, her coat buttoned to the neck as though she had meant to arrive somewhere, not die there. A handbag rested a few feet away, upright, absurdly neat. It was the smallness of it all that struck me, the delicacy of her gloved hands, the tilt of her head upon the frost-damp earth. Death had not disarranged her, it had simply interrupted her. Lewis crouched beside her, his breath visible in the cold. He said she'd not been there long. I agreed, though not for the reasons he gave. There was still warmth in the soil beneath her shoulder, faint but discernible detail too incongruous for November morning air. Someone had moved her. She had died elsewhere, a death out of place. We waited for the college doctor, a man whose eyes held that mixture of curiosity and distaste common to those who have seen too much mortality. He spoke briefly, clinically. Heart failure, perhaps, perhaps not. I nodded, pretending to listen. My mind had wandered to her shoes, black polished, but with a faint trace of chalky residue on the heel. Not garden soil. Stone dust. Something architectural, something from below. Later I stood in the chapel again. The air still carried the scent of candle wax and something older wet limestone, the breath of centuries. I thought of the crypt, the whispering beneath it, the note that had drawn me here. The woman's face came back to me, pale, composed, too deliberate. Death can be accidental, but arrangement seldom is. Bliss appeared beside me, carrying a small notebook. He said her name was Mrs. Kingsley, librarian at the Bodleian, married once, widowed twice. A woman who lived quietly, filed things correctly, attended evensong without fail. He added that she had no known reason to be in this college. I told him perhaps the reason was the wrong word, motive, maybe, or memory. He looked at me then, puzzled, and I could not blame him. It was not yet time to explain the line of thought that had begun to unspool itself in my mind, the connection between the handwriting on the note, the librarian's profession, and the faint trace of chalk that clung like dust from a forgotten tomb. I have learned that intuition, when voiced too early, sounds like madness. That evening I found myself in her room, off St. Giles. They were tidy to the point of unease, books aligned by size, letters bundled with thread, photographs face down as though modesty had outlived affection. On her writing desk a single envelope lay beneath a magnifying glass, addressed but unsent. The addressee was the college archivist, the same woman whose hand had written to me about the crypt, the same hesitant T. There was nothing inside the envelope, but the paper bore the faint indentation of a line once written and erased. I shaded it lightly with pencil until the words re-emerged. It was not an echo, it was a voice. I stayed there longer than I should have, listening to the hum of the city beyond the curtains, the sound of bicycles, of bells, of Oxford continuing its rituals of ignorance and revelation. I thought of the phrase again. Not an echo, a voice. Perhaps that was what had drawn her beneath the chapel. Not superstition, but recognition. The voice of something or someone calling up from the stone. I poured myself another whiskey that night, though it tasted less like comfort than confession. Some deaths announced themselves, others arrived disguised as remembrance. Hers, I felt, belonged to the latter kind. The next day brought brittle sunlight that revealed more than it warmed. Oxford has a way of appearing cleansed after death, as though the city itself prefers not to linger on such things. Yet I have always known better. The stones remember, even when the living forget. I began my morning in the Bodleian, among the smell of parchment and the faint scratching of pencils. The reading room was half empty, save for a few students, and an elderly scholar asleep over a Latin lexicon. The librarian's desk, once belonging to Mrs. Kingsley, stood neat and impersonal, her absence more eloquent than her presence could ever have been. Lewis joined me, his coat still damp at the shoulders. He said they had found no fingerprints of interest, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, a clean death, he called it. I thought the phrase was both precise and profoundly wrong. Death, like knowledge, is never clean. It stains even those who merely observe it. I wandered to the back shelves, tracing the spines of books, with my fingertips Milton, Donne, an anthology of monastic chants. It was then that I noticed a small index card misfiled among the catalogue slips. I would not have seen it had it not been slightly torn at the corner, as though handled in haste. The handwriting was familiar Mrs. Kingsley's. On it she had written a reference. Bartholomew's College, Crypt Inventory, 1842, and below that, 2 words underlined twice. Beneath voices, it was the sort of clue that refuses to behave like one part fragment, part taunt. I slipped the card into my pocket and told Lewis we were going for a walk. He sighed in that way of his, which manages to combine loyalty and resignation into a single breath. We returned to the college. The porter avoided my eyes as though guilt were contagious. The fellow's garden was roped off now, a patch of dying grass, watched over by nervous roses. I could almost see her still lying there, folded into the landscape like a misplaced line of poetry. In the chapel, the air felt different, emptier somehow. I stood by the lectern where the sunlight through the stained glass formed bars of colour across the flagstones. There, faint but visible, were footprints, not of mud, but of dust, fine and grey, leading toward the chancel. They were too small to be mine, too recent to belong to the porters. I followed them to the trap-door, the same one we had opened before. It was ajar now, though I remembered closing it. The smell that rose from below was damp and metallic, a mingling of stone and memory. I knelt, touched the hinge, and found the faintest trace of oil. Someone had been down there again, someone who knew how to move quietly in sacred spaces. Lewis muttered something about the place giving him the creeps. I almost envied him for his simplicity. Fear is honest, doubt is the more corrosive thing. I told him to fetch a lantern. When he left, I lingered, staring at the floor. There was a single sheet of paper tucked beneath the altar rails, torn from a reference volume. I recognized the heading Liturgical Annotations, 17th century. The page number was missing, but a faint penciled note ran along the margin, not erased. Hidden. The deduction came not as revelation, but as quiet confirmation. The crypt inventory Mrs. Kingsley had been examining, the one dated 1842, had likely recorded something long removed yet never destroyed. A relic, perhaps, or something less pious. She must have found mention of it in these annotations, traced its echo down to the chapel itself. And heard what? A sound, a voice, a truth too strange to survive daylight. When Lewis returned, I said nothing of the page or the footprints. There are moments when explanation only diminishes the mystery. He handed me the lantern, and we descended once more into the dark. The air was colder this time. Water dripped somewhere beyond the reach of the light, rhythmic as a clock's heartbeat. I felt again the strange pull of the place, as though the past were inhaling slowly. Around us! My torch caught a glint on the wall, a scrap of metal, a hinge, or perhaps something older embedded in the mortar. I brushed it with my sleeve and heard a hollow sound, like breath behind stone. I did not tell Lewis what I thought then, that the crypt was less a burial site than a concealment, that the voice Mrs. Kingsley had heard was not divine, but human. When we climbed back into the light, the college bells began to toll for midday. Their sound chased through the corridors, filling them with an odd sort of dignity. I remember thinking how Oxford so often mistakes solemnity for truth. That night, alone in my room, I opened the index card again. Beneath voices. I turned the words over in my mind until they lost their meaning, until they became merely sound, soft, elusive, almost kind. Footsteps, faint and receding, in the corridors of memory. I had not intended to return to the college that evening. There are hours, in the twilight hours, when one's mind drifts too close to obsession, when the whiskey glass trembles with unasked questions. I should have gone home, played a record, perhaps stared long enough at the crossword until words ceased to matter. Instead, I found myself walking beneath the dripping archway of St. Bartholomew's once again, the rain turning the cobbles into a surface of quiet, distorted reflections. The porter's lodge was still lit. It had that air of reluctant vigilance, the kind that belongs to men who spend their lives keeping watch over the lives of others. He looked up when I entered, startled perhaps, or simply weary. I told him I was there to look at something, though I wasn't sure what that meant until I said it. Behind the counter stood a wall lined with photographs, formal portraits of former fellows, cricket 11s, prize-giving ceremonies. They hung like fragments of an interrupted conversation, smiling faces belonging to decades that no longer existed. I had passed them before without thought, but that night they caught me. Something about them had changed, or perhaps I had. There was one frame slightly askew. I noticed it first, not with my eyes, but through that quiet tug in the mind that signals imbalance. The photograph within showed a group of students gathered at the chapel steps robes, mortarboards, and the faint glow of summer around their shoulders. It could have been any year, but the caption beneath it read, 1968. In the back row, almost hidden, stood a young woman, head turned slightly, expression unreadable. Her face was familiar in the way half-remembered dreams are. I asked the porter if he knew her. He frowned, leaned closer, adjusted his glasses. He thought she might have been a librarian's assistant, briefly employed in the archives. He remembered her laugh, he said, soft but peculiar, as if she were laughing at herself. I asked her name. He hesitated. Something with a K, perhaps Kingsley. It was absurd, of course. The woman in the photograph looked 20 at most. Our Mrs. Kingsley had been in her 40s. Yet there was something in the curve of the mouth, the shape of the jaw, that refused coincidence. I felt that quiet lurch one gets when the line between past and present begins to blur, when time folds upon itself like a trick of the light. I asked to see the back of the photograph. The porter seemed reluctant, as though afraid of disturbing something sacred. But he complied. The cardboard mount bore an inscription, faint and smudged to E for keeping the secret. The ink had faded to the colour of old tea. I asked him who E might have been. He shook his head, said there had been an Edmund in the bursary around that time, a quiet man who later went abroad. No one had heard of him since. Lewis arrived just then, summoned by some unspoken instinct of his to appear whenever a case begins to turn. I showed him the photograph. He looked puzzled and said it could be a relative, maybe a coincidence. I didn't answer. Instead, I studied the composition, the way the woman's hand rested on the chapel rail, the faint shadow behind her shoulder. There was another figure there, almost obscured, blurred as if in motion. A man, taller, his face indistinct. The porter said the photographer had been a local man, one who often took the college portraits. He died years ago, but his negatives were rumoured to still exist somewhere in town, in a forgotten box among parish records. I made a note to find them. As we left the lodge, Lewis mentioned dinner, the mundane gravity of sausages and mash. I declined. My appetite had gone somewhere darker. Back in my car, I placed the photograph on the dashboard. The woman's gaze seemed to follow me through the rain-smeared glass. There was, I thought, something almost deliberate in her presence, an invitation, or a warning. The inscription replayed itself in my mind to E for keeping the secret. The phrasing struck me as wrong. Secrets are never kept. They merely wait. That night, as I sat by the window of my flat overlooking the pale lamps of Jericho, I realized what unsettled me most. It wasn't like that. It was the possibility that Mrs. Kingsley had once stood exactly where her younger self had, on those same chapel steps, staring into a camera lens that had already captured her future. Oxford has its ways of bending time. It never forgets, but it never fully reveals. And somewhere beneath the whisper of rain against the glass, I thought I heard the faint click of a shutter closing on something long unfinished. It was in the college common room that I first heard of the quarrel. The details were vague, passed through the gentle distortion of academic gossip, but the tone was unmistakable. Resentment laced with intellect. It's a dangerous combination, particularly among those who prefer their duels fought with words. Lewis had mentioned, somewhat offhandedly, that one of the fellows had been overheard arguing with Mrs. Kingsley the week before her death. Poetry, of all things, was the subject. The man's name was Dr. Halloranna, specialist in romantic literature, whose fondness for Keats was matched only by his contempt for colleagues less acquainted with metre. I recalled him dimly, a man of exquisite manners, which is to say, a man who could wound without raising his voice. I found him that afternoon in the senior common room, seated by the window, a glass of sherry before him like a small, obedient son. He looked up as I entered, his expression composed, faintly amused. He asked if I was here to talk of tragedy or semantics. I told him the two often amount to the same thing. He smiled, and in that smile there was fatigue, perhaps even guilt, though too well-schooled to show itself fully. He said Mrs. Kingsley had accused him of misquoting Coleridge in a lecture of twisting the line for effect. He had replied that interpretation was the privilege of survival. She had walked out then, visibly shaken, though why he could not say. It was, as he put it, a disproportionate response to a poetic disagreement. I watched him as he spoke. He was lying, but not about the quarrel. About its subject, perhaps, or about the reason it mattered. The conversation stayed with me long after I left him. There was something peculiar about his choice of poem Coleridge, the poet of fragments, of guilt, of unfinished confessions. I found myself back in the Bodleian before dusk, tracing through Mrs. Kingsley's notes in the archives. She had marked several lines in the margin of an anthology, and I have told thee that my soul is weary. Beneath it she had written, in her careful, upright hand, he changed the word. It was such a small thing, he changed the word. But that is where deceit begins in the alteration of what was meant. I compared her version with the standard text. In Halloran's published paper, the line read, "And I have told thee that my heart is weary." Heart, not soul. The difference seemed trivial to anyone without a certain sensibility. To Mrs. Kingsley it must have felt like blasphemy. Lewis found me still there after closing time, the lamps already dimmed. He asked if I thought this quarrel had anything to do with her death. I said everything has to do with something else, though the connections are seldom polite enough to show themselves. He muttered that poetry never killed anyone. I almost told him he was wrong. Words have killed more people than bullets ever could. Outside, the evening fog had rolled in from the river, thick and luminous. Oxford in fog feels like an unfinished sentence, and perhaps that's why I love it. As we walked past the chapel, I thought again of Mrs. Kingsley's final message. It was not an echo, it was a voice. Echoes, after all, repeat without change. Voices alter meaning, they edit the past. The deduction was slight, almost nothing at all, yet it took hold of me. Halloran's alteration of Coleridge, his quarrel with Mrs. Kingsley, her note about hearing voices beneath the chapel-eek was an act of translation, a corruption of truth. The pattern was linguistic, not physical. Something had been rewritten, both in verse and in life. Back in my room, I read the poem again, aloud this time, though softly, as one might speak to the dead. The line, restored to its original form, carried an ache the substitute had destroyed. Soul, not heart. There was a difference one could feel, if not explain. I poured myself a whisky and stared at the dark surface of the glass. Reflection? Distortion? Translation? These are the ways the past speaks to us. We never hear it as it was, only as it wishes to be remembered. Later, long after midnight, I found myself murmuring the line once more, as if to keep her company. My soul is weary. In that moment, it seemed less a lament than a confession. And perhaps that is what she had wanted Halloran to admit, not error, but sorrow. It was raining again when she came to see me. Not the sudden, violent kind, but the sort that lingers, soft and insinuating, finding its way into the fabric of one's thoughts. I had been sitting by the window in my flat, a book half open, the light unkind. The knock was light enough to be mistaken for memory. She stood there, small and pale, the kind of woman Oxford creates and then forgets her voice barely disturbing the air. She said she was Mrs. Lytton, assistant to Mrs. Kingsley, at the Bodleian. She had heard what had happened, and there was something she thought I ought to know. I let her in, though not before a moment's hesitation, that brief inward calculation that always precedes the discovery of something unpleasantly true. She spoke quickly at first, as if afraid she might lose courage halfway through. Mrs. Kingsley, she said, had been troubled in recent months, distracted, secretive, prone to long absences in the evenings. She had become obsessed with a certain manuscript, one recently donated to the library from the college archives. A devotional text, she called it, though her eyes flickered when she said it, as though she knew the phrase was a disguise. She paused there, looking down at her hands, their small, nervous movements betraying a lifetime of silent correction. I poured her a glass of sherry, though she hardly touched it. She said there had been an argument one night, long after closing, between her and Mrs. Kingsley. Something about authorship, or forgery. Mrs. Kingsley had insisted that the manuscript contained evidence of something lost, something deliberately erased from the college's records. A woman's name, she thought, omitted from the list of benefactors centuries ago. Mrs. Lytton had tried to calm her, telling her she was chasing ghosts. Mrs. Kingsley had replied that ghosts are the only ones who tell the truth. I asked her when this had happened. She said 3 nights before the death. She had left Mrs. Kingsley in the reading room, alone with the manuscript. When she returned the next morning, the book was gone. Lewis arrived midway through her account, bringing with him the damp smell of rain and the faint irritation of the living interrupting the dead. He said quietly that the missing manuscript had been found that morning in Mrs. Kingsley's rooms. It lay open on her desk, its pages blank. Not scraped or faded blank, as if unwritten. I watched Mrs. Lytton's face then. She did not seem surprised. She whispered that the writing had always been faint, visible only in certain light or to certain eyes. I asked what she meant. She said Mrs. Kingsley believed the text had been written with something other than ink, a reagent of sorts perhaps, invisible except by candlelight, but the college had forbidden candles in the archives, and so she had borrowed a key to the chapel where she might study it by flame. That was where she heard the voice beneath the stone. The confession, if one can call it that, came softly, almost tenderly. Mrs. Lytton had followed her there that night, worried for her state of mind. She had seen the trapdoor open and had heard the chanting, or what she thought was chanting. She hadn't gone down. She had waited until the sound stopped. When she looked again, the light had gone out. I asked her why she hadn't spoken sooner. She said no one would have believed her. And besides, she hadn't been sure whether what she'd heard was real. Oxford does that to people. It blurs the line between knowledge and imagination until neither feels entirely safe. When she left, I walked her to the gate. The rain had turned to mist, the kind that seems to dissolve the edges of things. I watched her go, a solitary figure crossing the quadrangle, and felt that peculiar ache that comes from knowing the truth has brushed past you and gone on to die elsewhere. Later, I took out the small index card from my pocket, the one with Mrs. Kingsley's handwriting, beneath voices. I placed it on the table beside my glass and stared at it until the ink blurred. Perhaps she had not meant the voices of the dead at all. Perhaps she had meant us the living, speaking through our silences, confessing not to others, but to ourselves. I first saw her in the cloisters behind the chapel, where the rain had begun to collect in silver threads along the stone gutters. She was standing quite still, one gloved hand resting on the railing, the other holding a small book as if she were reading the weather instead of the words. Her coat's deep, faded green corduroy seemed to absorb the dimness around her, drawing light the way the past draws memory. Lewis and I had come to speak again with the bursar, a tiresome man with a fondness for the phrase strictly irregular. He had little to offer about Mrs. Kingsley's death beyond the usual assurances that no one, of course, had expected such a thing. But it was the woman in green who caught my attention, not by movement, but by stillness. She turned slightly when I passed her, a face of quiet symmetry, pale as the interior of a seashell. She said my name, though softly, as one might test a memory. I asked if we'd met. She smiled, but the smile held some unreadable recognition, or guilt, or perhaps a kind of sorrow that had learned to wear politeness as disguise. She told me she had known Mrs. Kingsley. Not well, she said, but well enough to have shared an understanding. The phrase struck me. I asked what sort of understanding. Her eyes moved toward the chapel where the evening light trembled through stained glass. She said there are friendships built not on affection, but on knowledge, and sometimes that knowledge is unbearable. Lewis had gone ahead, leaving me alone with her in the dim arcade. I asked her name. She hesitated, as though the question itself were too forward. Clara Halloran, she said at last. The name fell into place like a slow piece of music reaching its proper key. Haloranthe, same as the poet's collar, the man who'd quarrelled with Mrs. Kingsley over Coleridge. I asked if she was his wife. She nodded, but her expression did not change. She said her husband had spoken of me. Admiringly, she added, though I doubted that was true. Then, after a pause, she asked whether I believed that a lie, once written, could alter the nature of truth itself. I replied that in Oxford, most truths begin as lies and end as footnotes. That made her laugh, a short, brittle sound that broke like glass underfoot. When she left, I followed her only with my eyes. The hem of her green coat brushed against the wet flagstones, leaving faint marks that glistened briefly before the rain erased them. Lewis returned just then, holding a sheaf of papers. He said the bursar had confirmed something odd. Mrs. Kingsley had recently requested access to the college's financial archives, not the library ones. She'd been looking into the Halloran Endowment Fund, established nearly a century earlier. The connection was beginning to form, fragile as the first line of a crossword. Back at the station, I spread the papers across my desk. The bursar's records were dull until the name appeared again, Halloran Bequest, 1893. Established for the maintenance of chapel manuscripts and the support of widows of deceased fellows. The irony was almost indecent. Beneath the heading was a notation in a more recent hand revised 1968, the year of the photograph. It was a small detail, but it anchored the shape of something larger. The photograph in the porter's lodge had shown a young woman standing beside the chapel steps, half hidden. Clara, perhaps, before she became Mrs. Halloran, or Mrs. Kingsley before she became something else. The resemblance I'd dismissed earlier now seemed deliberate, orchestrated, like the repetition of a musical motif. I thought again of Clara's question whether a lie could change the truth. Perhaps that was what this entire case was, a lie written too carefully to erase. The forgery Mrs. Kingsley had suspected in the archives may not have been in ink at all, but in history. A life rewritten, a benefactor renamed, a secret pressed into the folds of a bequest. That night I dreamed of her coat green against grey stone, rain shining like candlelight on the fabric. When I woke, the phrase she'd used lingered like smoke, friendships built not on affection, but on knowledge. I knew then that whatever bound the two women Kingsley and Halloranite was not rivalry nor pity, but complicity. Oxford slept beneath the rain, dreaming its careful dreams. Somewhere, beneath all that decorum, someone had rewritten the past. And as I poured myself a whiskey, I found I could not decide which was more dangerous, the lie that hides the truth, or the truth that hides the lie. I had begun to think of the case less as an investigation and more as a palimpsest layer of meaning overwritten by time and guilt. Each revelation, when it came, seemed less like discovery and more like remembrance. That morning the sky hung low and colourless above Oxford, as though the city itself had misplaced its convictions. Lewis arrived with the newspaper folded under his arm, muttering something about an editorial on police inefficiency. I let it pass. He placed on my desk a single sheet of parchment encased in plastic relics from the recovered manuscript Mrs. Kingsley had been studying. He said the technicians found it wedged behind a false panel in her writing desk. I could see, even before touching it, that it was unlike the rest, smoother, older, the ink faint to the point of non-existence. There was no text, only the ghost of one. Lines erased, perhaps, or never written at all. Lewis asked what I thought of it. I told him it was a page that had decided to forget itself. He didn't laugh. The archivist, when questioned later, insisted there had always been a missing page in the 1842 crypt inventory, the one Mrs. Kingsley had obsessed over. Page 47. Its absence had been noted in pencil by a previous librarian sometime in the 1930s. She could not say why it mattered, only that Mrs. Kingsley had returned to it again and again, tracing the edges of absence as though it might yield confession. I went back to St. Bartholomew's. The chapel was empty, the air thick with the smell of damp hymnals and extinguished candles. The rain had found its way through the roof again, forming small reflective pools on the flagstones. As I stood there, I thought of her bent over her desk, candle flickering, whispering to herself that phrase, not an echo, a voice. It was then that I noticed something curious. The framed memorial plaques along the north wall were unevenly spaced. The gap between the second and third was wider by a finger's breadth, enough to disturb the symmetry of the row. I stepped closer. The mortar around the middle frame was newer, the colour subtly different. Oxford rarely renovates for sentiment. Only secrets demand such precision. I pressed gently at the edge. It shifted. Behind it lay a cavity no larger than a book. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a second parchment similar in texture to the blank one Lewis had shown me. But this one was not blank. The text was faint but legible, its ink brown with age. It appeared to be a fragment of the missing inventory listing not relics, but donors. At the bottom, beneath the formal script, was a single name added later in another hand female, unmistakably. C. Halloran. I stood there for a long time, the sound of rain breaking against the glass above me. The inscription wasn't proof of anything, yet it felt like the outline of motive thin, elegant, nearly invisible. If Mrs. Kingsley had found this page, or even known of its existence, she might have understood something about her friend's past that others were content to let fade. Perhaps she had gone too far in wanting to make it known. Oxford forgives almost anything except revelation. I showed the fragment to Clara later that evening. She met me in the reading room, the same green corduroy coat folded neatly beside her chair. Her expression when she saw the name was difficult to read. She said her husband had once joked that her family name was better buried, that it belonged to an ancestor whose generosity had been struck from college records for reasons best forgotten. I asked if she had told Mrs. Kingsley that story. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said, but not in seriousness. We were speaking of poetry. Lewis thought we were chasing ghosts. He was right, of course, though ghosts have always made the best witnesses. I kept the parchment overnight on my desk, unable to resist reading it again and again under the lamplight. Each time the letters seemed to retreat, the ink paling as though the page were trying to disappear. Before sleep, I poured a measure of whiskey and considered what had begun to form a pattern of erasures, each chosen with care. The page that never was had existed only long enough to be removed, like the women whose names are edited out of history, leaving behind the faint scent of presence and regret. I dreamt of turning a book whose pages grew thinner with each one read, until the last became light itself, untouched, unwritten, waiting. When I woke, the dawn light was colourless and patient, the same as the city that had taught me long ago absence too can tell the truth if one listens long enough to the silence it leaves behind. There are moments when the investigation of a crime becomes less about the living and more about the language of the dead. Words half erased, phrases misplaced, meanings reversed by those who survived to record them. I had been staring at the crossword in the Times that morning, a habit both trivial and essential. Words, after all, are where logic hides its poetry. Lewis had rung me far too early, his voice carrying that curious mixture of irritation and respect that years of reluctant companionship produce. There had been another discovery at the college, something electrical this time, which already made it uninteresting to me. A maintenance man had found a severed wire behind the altar, one that fed into the chapel's lighting system. The bursar had insisted it was mere coincidence. I had stopped believing in coincidence long ago. The chapel looked different in daylight, less haunted, more fallible, a practical structure for impractical faith. The wire ran along the north wall and disappeared behind a carved panel near the organ loft. Lewis crouched beside it, muttering about faulty connections. I said nothing. What struck me was not the wire itself, but the pattern of dust disturbed around interval, deliberate, almost human. Someone had stood there recently, not to repair, but to listen. It was while Lewis was speaking to the porter that I noticed the crossword folded neatly In the hymn book beside the lectern, yesterday's edition, several clues filled in, most incorrectly, a hand unused to such puzzles, yet one answer caught my eye. 7 letters, whisper. The clue had read voice that remains after silence. A strange inversion. Or a confession. I took the paper back to my office, the letters swimming before me like something dredged from a canal. Mrs. Kingsley had loved crosswords. I remembered her telling me, months before, that she found comfort in their rules, each square an act of containment, each clue a small redemption. I wondered whose hand had written this one. The handwriting was broad, male, confident in error. I called Halloran to the station that afternoon. He arrived immaculate as ever, smelling faintly of rain and paper. I showed him the crossword. He smiled, said it wasn't his, though his eyes flickered at the word whisper. He mentioned that his wife often filled them in to pass the time, though she preferred cryptics to quick ones. I asked if she ever left them in chapels. He didn't answer. When he left, I studied the puzzle again. Some clues formed accidental patterns when read together, hidden, beneath, voice altered. It wasn't proof, of course, merely a suggestion, yet suggestion, in Oxford, often achieves more than fact. Lewis returned with a report from the telephone exchange. Apparently, Mrs. Kingsley's number had received several late-night calls from a payphone near the college gates in the weeks before her death. No message ever left. Crossed wires, the clerk had called it. Perhaps, but I have always found that communication fails not for want of clarity, but of courage. That evening, I walked along the High, the lamps flickering through the drizzle like uncertain thoughts. I stopped at the kiosk outside St. Bartholomew's, the one matching the report. It smelled of wet metal and loneliness. I lifted the receiver. The line was dead, but faintly, beneath the static, I thought I heard something like a rhythm, almost like breathing. Or perhaps memory. I have never trusted the difference. Later, back in my room, I unfolded the crossword once more. The paper had dried into a fragile translucence, the ink bleeding faintly around each answer. I took a pencil and began to fill the remaining blanks. Not to solve, but to listen. One clue read truth concealed by faith 5, I wrote an altar. Another echo mistaken for confession. 6, I wrote murmurs. When I finished, the grid looked oddly complete, though not entirely correct, much like the case itself. As the clock struck midnight, I realized the real deduction had nothing to do with words at all. It was about substitution, the way one thing replaces another, quietly, almost politely. A voice for a whisper, a confession for a call, a woman's death for a secret too long buried. I poured the last of the whiskey and stared at the crossword, the light catching the faint imprint of another page beneath it, the ghost of an earlier puzzle half erased. The answers no longer mattered. What mattered was the pattern, the way the lines crossed, perfectly, irrevocably, just as lives do. It was Lewis who brought it to me, wrapped in brown paper, and a silence that felt almost deferential. He said it had been found in one of the Bodleian side rooms, tucked between 2 volumes on liturgical history that hadn't been borrowed in decades. He placed it on my desk as though it were evidence, though his face suggested he wasn't entirely certain of what crime it belonged to. The parcel was lighter than I expected. When I unwrapped it, a faint smell of mildew and candle soot rose like a sigh from another century. Inside lay a thin stack of pages bound by a fraying thread, the first leaf unmarked, no author, no title. The handwriting is neat but oddly inconsistent, as though written by someone at war with their own composure. The first words are what I remember most. To erase is not to forget, Lewis asked whether it was important. I told him that everything unlabelled in Oxford was important. That was how the city protected its secrets from cataloguing. The text itself was fragmentary, alternating between the confessional and the academic. It spoke of the chapel's foundation, of relics misattributed and donations reworded to suit reputations. There was mention of a benefactor whose name had been struck from every ledger, replaced by initials that shifted with each transcription, CH in one passage, CAH in another, and once, only once, a full name Clara Halloran written, then crossed out so violently the paper tore. I remember reading that line more than once, tracing it with my thumb. The manuscript seemed less written than excavated. Each word felt recovered, reluctant to stay visible. And through its gaps one could sense an argument taking place, not on the page, but between the lines. Guilt arguing with duty. Love arguing with the truth. Lewis grew restless. He said it looked like nothing more than an old thesis draft. Perhaps it was, but certain phrases refused to belong to scholarship. One, in particular, returned again and again in faint pencil across the margins. The missing page must remain missing. The same phrasing Mrs. Kingsley had once used in her letter to the archivist, the one I hadn't been able to place until now. I felt the small thrill one feels when the pattern begins to form the pulse beneath the puzzle. There was a note at the end of the manuscript, short, unsigned. Do not return this to the archive. The truth is a kind of vandalism. The handwriting was unmistakable, Mrs. Kingsley's. I sat there a long while, the pages spread before me, the evening dimming into its usual shade of regret. Outside, the rain began again, soft, repetitive, the sound of thought made physical. I tried to imagine her sitting where I now sat, reading this same document, feeling that same unease creep into her reason. She must have realized, as I did, that the erasure she'd uncovered wasn't a clerical accident. It was deliberate, personal. Perhaps that was why she'd written to me. The note that started it all, the one inviting me beneath the chapel, hadn't been an invitation to investigate, but to understand. She wanted to confess, but vicariously through another's curiosity. I poured myself a whiskey, the kind of small defiance the living allow themselves when they trespass too far into the thoughts of the dead. I read the first page again. To erase is not to forget. The phrase felt less like philosophy than warning. The handwriting trembled halfway through as if the writer had flinched at what followed. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him, perhaps too quickly, that it was a dedication. To someone they could not name. He frowned, saying that people in Oxford never say what they mean. I told him that was precisely why Oxford existed. He left soon after, his footsteps fading down the corridor, the door closing with that reluctant gentleness only rain can teach. I turned to the last page again where Mrs. Kingsley's annotation lingered, half erased. If you read this, you will see her as I saw her, alive. I closed the file. The manuscript without a title, I thought, was not a record of history, but its refusal. A dialogue between the vanished and the guilty, between what was written and what was silenced. As I extinguished the lamp, I could almost hear the faint rustle of paper beneath the stone, the voice that was not an echo, but something older, patient, unfinished. A city remembering what it had tried so carefully to forget. It was evening when I returned to St. Bartholomew's, the kind of hour when the city begins to dim into self-reflection. The lamps along the High were just lighting, their reflections quivering in the wet cobblestones like thoughts one tries not to revisit. Lewis had gone home hours before, having declared the case, or whatever it was, to be finished. He was wrong, though I didn't have the heart to tell him. Things like this are never finished. They simply stop asking to be solved. The porter seemed surprised to see me again. I told him I had forgotten something, though I didn't specify what. It was a lie, but a comfortable one. The truth was simpler. I had come to look once more at the place where Mrs. Kingsley's story had begun to unravel the library steps. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried its aftertaste. The steps glistened faintly beneath the lantern above the archway. I stood there, watching the slow gathering of night over the quad, and for a moment I thought I could almost see her again. A figure ascending the steps with a book pressed to her chest, head bowed, purposeful. That image had lingered with me since the beginning. I had always imagined her moving upward, never down. There are certain moments in a case as small, stubborn ones that resist explanation. For me, it was the position of her shoes. The day they found her, she'd been lying in the Fellows' garden, her shoes still polished, the soles clean. Not a trace of mud. I had dismissed it at first as trivial, but standing there now I saw it differently. She hadn't walked through the grass. She had fallen from somewhere higher, somewhere like these steps. I knelt down, my knees protesting, and traced the stone with my fingertips. The surface was smooth, worn by generations of scholars and caretakers, but near the fourth step there was a shallow groove, unnatural, a scratch, the kind left by the edge of a buckle, perhaps a shoe clasp catching on descent, or being dragged. The light shifted as the clouds moved, and for a moment the stone seemed to breathe. I remembered the photograph in the porter's lodge, the group gathered on these very steps decades earlier, the young woman half hidden in the back row. I had looked at it so many times that it had become almost personal, like an old dream that keeps returning until you agree to listen. Lewis had dismissed my fixation with the photograph. People resemble each other, he'd said. Oxford is full of doubles. But he hadn't seen what I'd seen, the faint mark in the corner, a blurred thumbprint that had never belonged to the photographer. I'd noticed it the first time we examined it and thought little of it, but the same smudge appeared faintly on one of the pages of the untitled manuscript. A mark repeated across decades, linking the living to the vanished. Inside the library, the air was close and perfumed faintly with polish and paper dust. The floorboards gave that familiar creak, the sound of intellect aging. I climbed the narrow stair to the upper gallery, the same route Mrs. Kingsley had favoured during her late visits. The window overlooked the chapel roof. Beyond it, the courtyard lamp cast a narrow pool of gold that ended precisely where the steps began. I stayed there a long time, tracing the pattern of light and shadow. If she had fallen, it was here, near the window's edge. There was no railing, no sign of struggle, only the faintest residue of wax near the sill-candle wax, pale and hardened into the wood. She must have brought it here, perhaps to read by, perhaps to see what could only be seen in flame. A relic of her search for what she called the voice beneath the stone. I touched the mark and felt the strange chill of understanding, not the comfort of closure, but the ache of recognition. She had come here not to expose the truth, but to witness it, to confirm something she already knew. Outside, the bells began their slow tolling across the city, marking the half-hour as though time itself were reconsidering its duty. I left the library quietly, closing the door without sound. The porter was gone. The quad lay empty, the rain returning in delicate threads. At the foot of the steps I paused once more and looked upward. There was no ghost, no figure, no revelation. Only the faint glow of the library window, a square of trembling light against the night. I thought of Mrs. Kingsley's final words, the ones written in the margins of that vanished page, to see clearly. One must first forget. Perhaps that had been her final act. A deliberate surrender to the silence she had so carefully pursued. I walked away then, slowly, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the rain. Somewhere behind me, the window darkened, and Oxford folded itself once more into secrecy. It was late when I returned to the Bodleian. The porter at the gate, half asleep beneath his lamp, looked up as I passed but said nothing. Oxford after dark always carries the air of trespass, as though the city itself resents being awake. I have often thought that knowledge, when hoarded too long, begins to haunt the places that keep it. The archives are proof enough. Inside, the silence was complete, a silence that doesn't quite rest, but listens. The air smelled of old paper and polish, faintly metallic, like rain soaked through brass. I switched on the desk lamp, its circle of light falling upon a stack of folders left from earlier in the day. The manuscript without a title lay open among them, the ink fading further each time I looked. Lewis would have called it imagination, but I've learned that what vanishes often does so in stages, as though testing our willingness to let go. I began turning the pages again, slower this time. Each one seemed thinner than the last, its texture giving way to translucence. The margins were alive with corrections, some written in Mrs. Kingsley's hand, others older, sharper, almost aggressive. I followed one line to the edge of the paper where a fragment of another note had been glued and later torn away. A small square of parchment clung stubbornly to the corner. I took a knife from my pocket and lifted it gently. Underneath, in letters faint as smoke, was a name I had not seen before. E. Hallow. The handwriting was precise, unadorned. I did not need to check the college records to know who it belonged to, the bursar who had insisted, with rehearsed sincerity, that he had known Mrs. Kingsley only professionally. The same man whose signature appeared on every request she'd made for access to restricted archives. I sat back and listened to the faint hum of the lights. Memory has its own acoustics. I recalled his office shelves arranged with military order, a faint smell of lavender, and a photograph of the chapel in sunlight. He had mentioned, almost absently, that he once sang in its choir as a boy. He'd said it without emotion, but I'd noticed the way his fingers traced the edge of the photograph when he thought I wasn't looking. Lewis always accused me of seeing ghosts where there were none. He might have been right. But ghosts have a peculiar way of hiding in the details, the half-truths people tell out of habit, the misaligned paper in a folder, the hesitation before a name. I turned to the back of the manuscript and found an inserted slip dated 2 years prior. A requisition note for the same volume Mrs. Kingsley had studied, the crypt inventory of 1842, the signature again, E. Hallow, this time approving his own request. I felt, rather than decided, that this was where the circle closed. The missing page, the erased benefactor, the forged endowment. Each act of correction had its origin not in malice but in inheritance. He had rewritten the record not to deceive, but to preserve what he wished the past had been. That kind of lie is almost tender. Almost. I left the library and stepped into the quadrangle. The rain had returned, fine and persistent, threading down the stone walls like veins of light. From somewhere beyond the cloisters, the faint sound of a choir rehearsal drifted through the mist. The boys' voices rose and fell in a melancholy scale, the melody old enough to have forgotten its own composer. I stood there a long time, listening. The sound seemed to seep into the stone, carrying with it the weight of everything unspoken. For a moment I could almost see her Mrs. Kingsley standing where I was now, her head tilted as though deciphering meaning in the music. Perhaps she had come to the same conclusion I had, that truth, once entombed, begins to echo until someone mistakes it for prayer. Lewis called later, his voice blurred by static. He asked if it was over. I told him yes, though I didn't believe it. He said something about loose ends, paperwork, closure. I said nothing. I poured a whiskey instead, watching the amber fold into the glass. Closure, I've always thought, is a word invented by the living to reassure themselves that the dead are finished speaking. When I looked again at the manuscript still on my desk, a faint impression had appeared where none had been before. Letters pressed through from the torn parchment, ghostly, incomplete. They formed only 2 words. Forgive me. I stared at them until the ink began to fade again, retreating into silence. Oxford does not bury its ghosts. It catalogues them, carefully, alphabetically, under the pretense of preservation. And yet they remain, breathing softly between the pages, waiting for the next pair of hands, foolish enough to read them aloud